We don't have a lot of people here. Okay. Regardless, we need visitation day ideas. Oh, thank you. Okay. We need somebody to volunteer from HF and from IO to be the liaisons for visitation day. I just saw in the chat that Maria Flores has volunteered to be the IO liaison. We'll still need thank you, Maria. We'll still need an HF liaison. Please talk with your advisor. And if you are able to help us out with this, that would be great. And then please coordinate with Corey, who's our usual visitation day guy. And please, any of the graduate students, I'm going to guess that in general, you're more savvy than the faculty, full-time permanent faculty, and you might have some cool ideas about what we could do with a virtual visitation day. Please provide those ideas also to either David, our graduate program director, or Corey, our visitation day coordinator. Last announcement, actually two announcements. We finally have our summer returns money in, and so there is now money to pay for some mini grants for research for stimulus materials. So let me know, and I'll be coordinating this with David, but we should have enough that we could even offer $400 or $500, you know, for people who need, depending on how many demands we have coming in. And then the last thing is I just want to note, he's probably not here today, but Nick Kovacs just graduated with his dissertation, has uploaded his document. He should be receiving his diploma in a few weeks. And he, a few weeks ago, started a new job with one of our previous IO PhD graduates who started out with a different company, is now running his own consulting firm. So we now have a Wright State graduate who started their own consulting firm and is now hiring our graduates. I think we've arrived. So thank you, Corey, for Chad Thompson. He's amazing. And I'm just delighted we have such an amazing alumni pool. So those are my announcements.
Thank you, Deb. Great news. Nathan, whenever you're ready, you can start.
All right. I want to thank everyone for coming out today and giving me and Russell this opportunity to talk about some research we've been working on since late 2018. I started working on this project when I was on sabbatical, and we've taken some time, and I think you'll see why there's really a lot to this project, but it's taken us a while to get where we're at today. So what I'm going to talk about is this ongoing project where my colleagues and I have developed a measure of organizational constraints. So this is going to provide a roadmap of what Russell and I are going to be covering today. We're going to start off by defining what organizational constraints are. We're going to discuss the implications for organizational constraints within the IO literature. So why is this an important topic? And then we're going to summarize our team's ongoing efforts to develop a multifaceted organizational constraint scale, which we're going to refer to as the MOCS for short. So first off, what are organizational constraints? What is the definition of this construct? Organizational constraints are a specific type of work-related stressor. Now, work-related stressors are anything in a person's work environment that require an adaptive response from the worker. And as a result, stressors have the potential to cause ill health. So organizational constraints are just one specific type of stressor, of work stressor. And organizational constraints really is a pretty broad concept. It's a pretty inclusive construct that encompasses several different kinds of conditions or events. And what all of these constraints have in common is there's something in the environment that interferes with effective job performance. So again, that can include a lot of different things. On this slide, we provide just a few examples just to kind of give you an idea of what constraints might involve. So for instance, not having sufficient training, having supervisors or coworkers who are disruptive, not having the right supplies or equipment. Those are all examples of constraints. Those are all things in a person's work environment that could potentially disrupt effective job performance. So why should we care about organizational constraints? Why does this topic matter? Well, the short answer is that organizational constraints are related to a lot of outcomes that we care about as organizational researchers. And I've categorized these various outcomes of constraints into really two groups. One of these groups is of outcomes is poor employee well-being. So that would include things like job dissatisfaction, burnout, physical symptoms, just a few examples. The other category of outcomes is poor job performance. This would include things like poor in-role performance, counterproductive work behavior, and withdrawal behavior, which would include absenteeism. And I would, if you read one article about organizational constraints, a good go-to article that summarizes sort of the state of the art on the topic is this Deck and Spector 2016. It's a pretty comprehensive meta-analysis on the topic. I believe Deb had a question, and I missed what her text was.
I just asked whether constraints reflect a category of a strong situation, because it seems like a strong situation can sometimes be positive. Are organizational constraints always negative?
Yeah, absolutely. A high level of constraint would be, we could frame that as being a strong situation. So for anyone who's not familiar with the concept of a strong situation is occurs whenever the situation basically overpowers the effects of individual differences. So when a situation is strong, personality traits don't exert the influence that they would typically exert. So in strong situations, everyone behaves more or less the same way. And so if you have a strong situation, you can imagine so let's say you have a lot of organizational constraints, you can imagine everyone behaving more or less the same way. So let's say if we were considering job performance, we may initially expect there to be individual differences in how well people perform at their job. But if they lack the resources, or if they lack the training to do their job well, that's sort of like a strong situation. If you don't have those resources or training that you need, then everyone, regardless of their personality, is likely to perform poorly. So I think this does very much map onto that concept of a strong versus a weak situation. So one question you might ask is, why are we pursuing this area of research? Why are we going through the trouble of developing a new measure? And whenever I have a graduate student or a colleague come to me and say, hey, I'm developing this new measure, my first reaction is, well, can you justify it? Is there a need for this new measure? Does it fill a worthwhile gap in the literature? After all, developing a new measure, if you do it right, if you go through the standard scale development process, it's going to take a lot of time, and it's going to take a lot of resources to develop that new measure. So before we started this project, we wanted to be sure that we had a compelling case for why a new constraints measure is needed. So one part of this is the fact that existing organizational constraint scales have very much taken a global perspective. They've measured overall organizational constraints. And by far, the dominant measure of organizational constraints has been Spector and Jex's 1998 scale. The Pindeck and Spector meta-analysis I mentioned a slide ago gave a breakdown of the percentage of studies that had used various organizational constraint scales. And the OCS was somewhere around 70%, used by about 70% of the studies in their meta-analytic database. So this by far dominates the literature, and it's a global measure. And as a global measure, the OCS gives us information about the overall level of constraints in a person's work environment. It will tell us, okay, does this person have a lot of constraints versus do they have little constraints? But it doesn't tell us the specific facets. It doesn't give us any facet level information about constraints. So that's the main justification. That's the main motivation for this project. And we see two potential benefits of having a facet measure available. One benefit is that if we're able to measure the facets of constraints, then that's going to give us a better understanding of the fundamental character of constraints. And of course, that's going to be something that organizational researchers care a lot about, understanding that basic fundamental character of the constraint construct. In addition, having a facet level measure is going to be beneficial to practitioners. A facet level measure will give us specific actionable information that we can use to guide organizational interventions and organizational policies. And that's something that's really not available if all we have is a global measure. You know, the global measures will tell us overall how much constraints are in a person's work environment, but those global measures really don't point to specific solutions the way a facet measure would. So kind of a quick rundown of the method we use to guide the scale development process. We followed a pretty standard process. This Hinkin article, I highly recommend if you're ever doing scale development. This is a widely cited guide to developing new measures. The Spectre book is also quite good, and there's a few others that I could recommend. As sort of the first step of any scale development process should be to clearly define the construct that you're trying to measure. So, in other words, what's included in this construct? What are its different dimensions if it has more than one dimension? What's excluded from the construct? What's not included in the definition? Those are all things you'll want to tackle in this first step. And in a little bit, I'll talk about this process. We spend a lot of time on trying to identify and to define these various facets. So I'll walk you through that process. Then, of course, once you have a good definition, a clear definition that the team agrees on, then you start to write items that are consistent with that definition, that tap into that definition. And as part of this, you're going to do some pilot testing, and I'll talk a bit about some pilot testing that we've done with the MOX items. And then finally, Russell's going to talk a bit about some of the analysis we've done to examine the reliability and validity of the MOX. All right, so the steps we went through in identifying the MOX facets, and this again very much gets at the heart of defining what organizational constraints, what the construct is, and what does it encompass, what does it include. So we did a few things, and we tried our best to practice due diligence here. One of the things you don't want to have happen when you're pursuing a scale development project is come up with a poor definition. If you have a poor definition, if you've poorly defined your construct, if you've omitted important content from your definition, and if you've included irrelevant content in your definition, those would all be disastrous for your project, because the definition is going to guide many of the decisions that you're going to make in subsequent steps. So we wanted to exercise due diligence. We spent a lot of time on the activities that we did in this slide. So the first thing we did is we reviewed seminal articles that describe the nature of the organizational constraints construct. This is just one example of a seminal article. There's probably 3 or 4 others I could have cited here, but we found this Peters and O'Connor 1980 article to be especially useful. They really unpack what they originally meant by organizational constraints. And if you read the article closely, you get a pretty good sense of what the facets of constraints would be if researchers would have from the very beginning measured this as a multifaceted construct. We also reviewed existing constraint scales. So back to the Spectre and JEX OCS. Even though it's a global measure of constraints, you can still make some inferences about what the facets of constraints might be just by reviewing the Spectre and JEX items. So we not only reviewed Spectre and JEX, there's a couple of other constraints, global constraints measures that aren't as used nearly as much as Spectre and JEX, but still get some use. We looked at those as well to get some ideas of what these constraints might be, these facets might be. We also conducted a pilot study that had an open-ended question where we gave a lay definition of organizational constraints, and we asked our participants to provide examples, up to 5 examples of constraints that they had recently experienced at work. So we compiled all this information. We've got our seminal articles, we've reviewed existing scales, we have this open-ended qualitative data. We brought all this together, and then fortunately our team has several colleagues who publish on the topic of organizational constraints. So we showed those colleagues our list and asked them, okay, based on this list, can you recommend any potential facets that we may have omitted? And so we ended up adding 1 or 2 additional facets that we had overlooked as a result of this impact, of this input. And so using this information, we identified initially this list of 23 potential facets. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because we're going to see this same slide again, the same table again in just a little bit. And when I show you this slide again, I'll sort of pause on that slide because I know there's a lot to take in here, and I want to give you a chance to see what the dimensions, what the facets are. All right, so based on that initial list of 23 facets that we identified that I showed on the previous slide, we wrote a total of 138 initial MOX items. This comes out to being 6 items for each of those 23 facets. At the beginning of this project, I had sort of a hunch that 3 items would be enough for each facet, just based on my experience with similar kinds of scales, based on my experience developing scales. I just sort of guessed that 3 items would probably be enough. So if we start off in our initial item pool having 6 items, that's going to give us some wiggle room so that we're able to eliminate items that don't function well in some of our initial data sets. So we start off with this item pool of 138 items. We did a pilot test that found, in fact, that my hunch was correct. You can reliably measure any one of our facets with 3 items. 3 item scales yielded Cronbach's alphas that were all above 0.89. Some were a good bit higher than 0.89. So moving forward with that, we collected another data set where we administered 3 item measures for all 23 facets. And we basically found 16 clean factors. And this was, I'm used to running EFAs, and the EFAs coming out ambiguous, and you get a bunch of cross loadings, and you expected a certain number of factors, and it identifies many less or many more factors than you expected. EFAs can be really tough to make sense of. This EFA, in my experience, was unusual in how clean it was. So we went from initially these 23 facets that we started with. The EFA identified 16. And we'll see what those 16 factors were in our next slide. But just sort of a summary of what these analyses showed, this EFA showed. These 16 factors each had eigenvalues of above 1. Those 16 factors accounted for a total, almost a good chunk of the variance in item variance. Our items loaded strongly on their respective factors. All those loadings were above 0.75. And our cross loadings were all relatively small. So all in all, a pretty clean factor structure. Now, this slide gives you a summary of the 16 facets that we retained. We actually have all 23 facets that we started off with here. I've crossed out the ones we ended up dropping after the EFA. And the main reason for dropping factors, dropping some of these facets is, well, some of the facets, it turns out, are empirically redundant with another facet in the mocks. So, for example, inadequate information, which we initially thought might be distinct from incorrect information. It turns out that those two are so intertwined, they're so redundant, that it makes no sense to include both. We ended up including incorrect information, and we dropped inadequate information. And you can kind of guess other instances of this. Supervisor disrupts work was redundant with supervisor fails to give help. We initially thought those might be distinct, but empirically they come out to be redundant. One of our dimensions we ended up deciding to drop because our goal here is really to come up with a measure that we thought would be relevant to jobs in general. We're not really focused on one specific occupation here. We're interested in jobs as a whole. It occurred to us that customers is not something that's present in every job, and so it was kind of tough to decide if we should cut this or not, but we decided to cut it just because it's not going to be applicable to many jobs, and we were also concerned about the length of this survey. I understand there's some research out there showing that careless responding is an issue in lengthy surveys, and that's something certainly we were mindful of. So I should say, I'd also like to note that is this sort of the final word when it comes to constraints facets? Are there other facets potentially out there that we overlooked? Well, of course there is. Moving forward, you can imagine there may be situations where we might identify additional facets. You can imagine if we were studying a specific occupation, we might come up with a slightly different set of facets. So for example, if we were studying people in information technology professions, this IT constraint dimension might be a whole lot more elaborate than what we've listed here. You can imagine with IT workers, they might distinguish between who knows how many different subfacets of this facet. So this is not the final word by any stretch, but we do think this is a good starting point moving forward. It'll be interesting to see what this leads to in terms of identifying additional facets of constraints. I'd also like to note that one of the things that really gets us excited about this topic is, although I framed this as an occupational stress presentation, I think it's apparent from these facets that this work really has applicability beyond just occupational stress. So for example, there is a rich, extensive literature on workplace culture that is independent of the occupational stress literature. This MOX measure would certainly be relevant to the culture literature. It would likewise be relevant to the training literature, the employee training literature, because one of our facets here is poor training as a constraint. And so that's really something that I think excites the team, our research team, when it comes to this project, just the applicability beyond just the occupational stress literature. To give you sort of an overview of what the MOX items look like, this is sort of the final measure, the final MOX version of the MOX, with 16 facets, 3 items per facet. I've given here as just an example of what the supervisor scale looks like. It comprises these 3 items, and each of the items start off with this first part of the item stem, and then each of these trailing parts are an individual item. So because my supervisor often fails to give me the help I need, my job is needlessly difficult. Each of our MOX items is on a 7-point scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So pretty standard sort of response format that we see a lot in occupational stress measures. And so moving forward, we have completed 2 studies, study 1 and study 2. Both of those are going to look at the construct validity of the mocks. We're in the process of collecting data for study 3 and study 4. Study 3 will also look at some construct validity issues for the mocks, but it will also address the test-retest reliability of the mocks, which is an important aspect really in any scale development project. And then study 4 is going to also address the construct validity of the mocks using a different sample from what we used in studies 1 and studies 2. So I'm going to hand it over to Russell. He's going to bring us on home by talking about studies 1 and study 2. Right, Russell, you want to share your slides?
Thank you, Nathan. Can you see my slides? Okay, thanks again. Okay, so to examine the validity of the mocks, we actually developed a normological network, and there were 2 sets of external variables. So the first set of external variables we considered was conceptually linked to all the 16 mocks facets, and the second set of external variables that we considered was conceptually linked to one and only one of the 16 mocks facets. I'm going to talk about these 2 sets of external variables in next couple of slides. So this is the partial normological network. Sorry. So this is the partial normological network of the correlations between our constraints facet and 2 sets of external variables for study 1 and study 2. We actually have 16 facets, but we are going to talk about only 3 facets here because we don't have enough time. So let me talk about study 1 in detail in next couple of slides before I start talking about study 2. So the study variables, so the variables for study 1 we had were global job satisfaction, organizational commitment, work-related frustration, and counterproductive work behaviors. We predicted that each of the external variables for study 1 would be related to all 16 mocks facets. Some of the characteristics of our sample, we had a Qualtrics panel data set, and we had 400 participants. The mean age of the participants was 38 years, mean job tenure 7 years. Mean hours work per week 40 hours, which are altogether important because they say that we had participants who were experienced workers. They also from various jobs, like the job titles are auditor, dental assistant, graphic designer, teacher. The importance of having a heterogeneous sample is that if we have statistically significant results, then we will be able to say that our results are more generalizable. To assess organizational constraints, we used mocks facets and OCS by Spector and Jakes. To assess the criterion variables, we used some standard and pretty well-known measures. Then we ran the confirmatory factor analysis. And if we look at the values of chi-square, P, CFI, TLI, RM, SEA, SRMR, we can say that our hypothesized 16-factor model fit reasonably well. There is definitely room to improve, but I would like to mention that this is the original model that we considered. Some descriptive statistics. Across the 16 facets, the average skill mean was 9.51, which is important because the possible values were from 3 to 21. as 9.51 is way more greater than 3, it clearly says that employees are experiencing some kinds of organizational constraints at work. Another important takeaway message from this slide is the Cronbach's alpha, which is very high, 0.93. So this is the correlation tables between the MOX facets and the external variables. As you see, we actually, sorry for the noise, we actually got the results the way we expected. For example, we expected global job satisfaction would be negatively related to its MOX facets. And counterproductive work behavior would be related positively to its MOX facets. There is a column called OCS on the right. We have had it because we wanted to show the comparisons between global MOX, global scales of organizational constraints, and facet-wise organizational constraint scale. So our MOX actually has 16 facets, and each facet has 3 items, which is actually 16 times 3, 48 items per scale. And if we compare our scale with the scale of Spector's and JX that has 11 items, our scale is really long scale. So what we did, we also developed a global MOX that's, sorry for the noise again, that has only 16 items, and each item actually represents each facet. So some of the characteristics of our global MOX, the internal consistency is 0.94. The correlation between our original 48 item MOX and 16 item global MOX is 0.97, and the correlation between our global 16 item MOX and the OCS is 0.74. So this is the regression table of the OCS, our global MOX, and the criterion variable. So we ran this hierarchical regression analysis to find whether our global MOX explains in criterion variable above and beyond the OCS. As you see, our global MOX actually explained additional variance in criterion variable above and beyond the OCS. For example, our global MOX explained 5% more variance in global job satisfaction after OCS was controlled for. Likewise, it explained 3% more variance in organizational commitment and 7% more variance in frustration. The only exception was counterproductive work behavior. We actually don't know what happened here. One reason that we think maybe the reason is both measures of counterproductive work behaviors and OCS are from Paul Spector's lab. These two scales have some items that have some subtle similarities in terms of words. So that may be a reason, but we're not sure. I would like to mention that we are still collecting 2 more data sets, and we are looking forward to analyzing them and find if we can actually come up with some kind of explanation that can explain this situation here. So this is the slide that I actually presented a while ago. And now I'm going to talk about the study 2, external variables. For a quick review, in study 2, we actually expected some of the external variables would be related to only one facet of our constraints facets. For example, we expected meetings per week and satisfaction with meetings would be related to only meetings facet of our MOX. So the variables for study 2 are satisfaction with supervision, supervisor social support, satisfaction with meetings, meetings per week, satisfaction with staffings, and extra task due to shortage. So some of the characteristics of the sample, we had a mechanical Turk sample, participants were 324, the mean age was 39, mean job tenure 6 years, mean hours worked per week 41 hours. These are all important because again, they all say we had participants who were experienced workers. And also they had different jobs, and that is also important because a heterogeneous sample would be helping us to say our results are more generalizable if we have statistically significant results. For study 2, we used mocks to assess organizational constraints, and we also used some standard and well-known measures to assess criterion variables. We also ran the confirmatory factor analysis, and if we look at the values of chi-square, P, CFI, TLI, RM, ACA, SR, MR, our hypothesized 16-factor model was less than ideal. However, I would like to mention that after looking at the modification indices, it is clear that if we free some paths between error terms, the model would be a better fit. I would also like to say that we haven't done that yet, because as a research team, we are planning to see it maybe next month, and then find out which paths are justified to be freed to make it a better fit model. Some descriptive statistics. Across the 16 facets, we had the average scale mean 8.57, which is important because it is way more greater than the lowest possible mean value 3. And it also clearly says that workers, they experience some kinds of organizational constraints at work. Another takeaway important message from here is the Cronbach's alpha, which was 0.95. So this is the correlation table between our constraints facets and external variables. This is actually a hypothesized correlation between the facets and the external variables. For example, we hypothesized that satisfaction with staff and extra task due to shortage would be related only with staffing facet. So now I'm going to move on to the next slide, which actually provides the empirical supports for this conceptualized relationships. In this slide, you see the correlations in the shaded cells, which were actually the hypothesized relationships between MOX facets and external variables, are way more higher than the correlations in the unshaded regions or unshaded cells. I know there are lots of information here, so I'm going to pause for a second so that you guys can digest the information here. All right, moving forward. So the remaining slides are discussion slides. I will talk about what we have found as recap for our MOX project. Then I will talk about the implications, and finally limitations and future research. So based on the statistical analysis for study 1 and study 2, the evidence that we found, they actually tell that the MOX has desirable properties. It has yielded high levels of internal consistency reliability, predicted important work-related criteria, and generally yielded a pattern of external variables that matches the pattern described in our nomological network. Implications, two types of implications. From the theoretical perspective, it may help researchers better understand the fundamental character of the OC construct. And from the practical implication perspective, it may provide practitioners with specific actionable information that is recommended to organizations in order to make it a better place to work in. Some of the limitations of our current project: we used cross-sectional studies. With cross-sectional studies, the best we can say the study variables are correlated. We can't establish any causal relationship between study variables. We also used self-reported data. With self-reported data, CMB is an always issue over there, though Spectre actually says that CMB issue is overstated. Ideal situations would be we use longitudinal studies and other reported data, for example, supervisor ratings. We also used online panel or crowdsourced samples. It would be really ideal if we use organizational data. In fact, for our short-term future research, we are going to collect two data sets. One of them would be MBA students sample. And we will use this MBA sample for testing our retest reliability as well as the construct validity. We will use another sample, that is Snowball sample. And the purpose of having Snowball sample is to replicate the findings that we have found in study 1 and study 2. For the long-term future research, we hope our mocks will be appreciated, accepted, and used by researchers. And down the road, maybe like 10 years or 15 years after, we would like to conduct a meta-analysis to further examine the construct validity of the mocks. And we would also like to develop mocks norms, and it would be helpful for the practitioners and the organizations to determine what scores are average scores, and based on that, they would be able to say whether mocks is higher in an organization or mocks is not higher in an organization. Finally, I, along with Nathan, would like to acknowledge our collaborators, Jesse Michael, a grad faculty at Auburn University, and Michael Ross, his grad student at the same institution. As Nathan mentioned, we actually have been working on this project for more than 2 years now. Hope it will turn out a great study. So the last slide, questions for you guys. And as I understand, this is the most important slide for any presentation. So Nathan and I are ready here, please.
Yeah, I guess just a general question I have is what do you anticipate the how is this? How many citations and how quickly do you anticipate this scale being used? Or is it something that you think might take a while for people to figure out about and learn about?
Hey, Alec, that's a good question. I guess my best basis for responding is back about 4 or 5 years ago, I published a scale development paper that described the development of another occupational stress scale. That paper focused on role ambiguity and role conflict, and we basically had identified some problems with the existing role ambiguity and role conflict scales, and we tried to correct those in that paper. And I'll say that paper has gotten a pretty steady number of citations. I don't know what the count is at now. I do get a lot of emails from other researchers. I probably get an email, once every week or two, asking about that particular scale. And so if that paper is any indication of what we can expect with the mocks, then I would imagine 10 or 12 years from now, we'll be talking about doing a meta-analysis on the mocks. But I guess it's really hard to forecast how popular this scale could end up being. Now, the Pindeck and Spectre meta-analysis from a few years ago had identified, I believe it was, I think it was about 120 organizational constraints studies that had been published from about probably mostly from about 2000 through about 2016. So that might give us some guess to how popular this topic is, and might give us some guess about how much use our scale might get. But again, it's hard to say. I think Corey has a question.
Okay, so maybe more of a discussion point. So I like your scale, and I like what you're doing. So I think you're running into a similar issue that I'm running into when I'm trying to design, or I'm working on designing a socioeconomic status scale that's something other than money, right? And looking at predicting success in college. And the conventional wisdom is that whether you're a first generation college student or not matters. Actually, that doesn't matter. Even at Wright State, it doesn't predict. What I'm finding predicting is if you have a good quality relationship with a relative. It could be a grandparent. It could be an uncle. Maybe one of your cousins is in college too, and then they help you, mentor you through what college is. And then there's money, right? Or your grandparents. Do you have grandparents alive that have money that can give you that money? Because when in college, I'm finding that for low-income college students, persistence really matters. They're going to run into some place where they're going to get stuck. They need a couple $1,000s from somebody to pay their rent to get them through a semester, or else they drop off and then they go into bartending, right? And so I've come to the conclusion that our field focusing on internal consistency, I don't think that's the way to go. My scale, when I play around the scale and just look at it as like a collection of items and kind of a checklist, and the more you have of these things, the more resources you have, the better it predicts, right? So paradoxically, and contrary to classical test theory, I can predict a lot better with a less internally consistent scale. So I think maybe what I'm going to suggest to you is, I think what really is important in success in a company is if you have a mentor, someone that's going to take an interest in your career. That could be your boss, and a lot of times that is. But guess what? Sometimes that's someone else's boss, or it could be a coworker, or someone that just takes you under their wing and tells you this is who you need to suck up to, this is who you need to avoid, this is what you need to do. Or it could be a past boss. So for example, just looking at some of your items, so existing item in the works, coworkers disrupt your work, right? Well, I would encourage you to keep collecting data on customers disrupting your work, supervisors disrupting your work, and so you have, I think you have an existing item, if supervisor fails to help. Well, I would encourage you to keep administrating items with customers fail to help. I think you may be able to improve prediction, and especially if you're thinking about this in terms of a meta-analysis approach, right? I think if you have a meta-analysis, you should be able to tease that out and look, okay, this scale is not very internally consistent, but here we have a meta-analysis with a full scale that's less internally consistent in collection of items versus our short internally consistent. Boy, a meta-analysis would be really interesting. Here's what we see. Here's a series of studies where they developed the full scale, and then here we just use this subset of items that's internally consistent and has a good factor structure. Which one predicts better? I think that meta-analysis, my prediction would be that meta-analysis will show that full, less internally consistent scale is probably going to predict better. And guess what? If you have a meta-analysis there, that is what it is, isn't it? That's going to show us that that's really what we should be doing. But I don't know, just a discussion point and an encouragement. I like what you're doing. I think you're really onto something.
Can I chime in on that?
Yeah, thanks, Corey.
Can I chime in on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
So in a former lifetime when I was a graduate student, we actually distinguish between heterogeneous and homogeneous scales. So actually it's a really shift that suddenly homogeneous scales are like the gold standard, when in fact we have some extremely predictive heterogeneous measures. So Wonderlic is one of those. And so there's nothing in there's nothing particularly magical about having a highly internally consistent scale. If you're looking for prediction, sometimes those heterogeneous measures capture more of the domain you're attempting to assess.
Yeah. So actually, Nathan, if you're interested, I'll send you Susie Dean's dissertation again that has some of these sites. And Deb's right. When you go back to the research in the 60s, the theory of Messick and some of these other researchers, big names, was not focusing on internal consistency. The idea was that you could have a homogeneous scale. If you're trying to predict a behavior, you should have a homogeneous scale with a wide range of things and a wide range of observations, especially if you're thinking about, a specific criteria or something that you're looking at. So I'll send it to you if you want to play around with it. But the big thing is, I think you're onto something, and I would say just don't limit your item. I mean, I think you have great items. Just don't administer your full scale and then look at the data too. I think you might find that there's something there.
I feel compelled to say that I wasn't in graduate school until long after the 1960s.
Yeah. Well, your point is well taken that when you were in graduate school, yes, things happened around 2000 is when we got this idea. Actually, Cortina, I think, then it's all internal consistency, and I'm not sure that's really what it is, but.
So one thing I think is worth bringing to the discussion is the distinction between formative indicators and reflective indicators. So I would suppose, Corey, your SES measure is more made up of formative indicators, whereas a constraint scale like this is more or less made up of reflexive indicators. So that's, I think, a distinction that's important to consider.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're going to compare across companies, for example, I'm thinking of an example. I know company does mortgages. I mean, things are just going gangbusters, right? And so the old model of going into an office, you have an appointment every hour, and you service 8 customers a day. Well, that's gone. And so I'm talking to someone I know that now they're online, and so they can service 10 or 11, 12 customers a day because they're in a queue. And the technology helps that. And guess what? They like it because they're at home, working at home. They don't have to actually see the customer. And then some days they might want to work a 3-hour day. Well, they can cover 4 or 5 customers and move on. And so, now in the past, so if you ask, so some industries that model can work. But guess what? I think there's some companies out there that, like in the creative, and that I'm thinking maybe like ads or something where you need a creative team to really contribute to come up with something new. It's hard for them without that face time in those informal meetings at the water cooler and stuff like that, right? Versus a production. And so I would say, if you're going to try and design a scale for all companies, well, you better be pretty broad, because some companies, that particular constraint just doesn't matter, right? Maybe you need a boss that's there all the time, but maybe in some jobs, maybe you really need a boss to troubleshoot for you and go against company policy and bend company policy, and interpret company policy in a way that you can do your job, rather than lord over you and make sure, okay, you need to do this, you need to do this. And, and for example, some managers might be really effective if they handle the problem customers and kind of screen them out and kind of tell those problem customers that you're not, in effect, you're not really worth our time. We're gonna fire you as a customer, right? So.
Right. Thank you, Corey. Any other questions? All right. If not, Russell and I would like to thank everyone. You've been a great audience.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan and Russell.
Thank you,
See you
Nathan.
next week.
Yes, please email your slides out, Nathan.
I will do that right away.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.